So today's devotion is a little bit PG-13, but don't worry. I'm not going to leave you there. I'm going to give you some practical advice to conclude our discussion on this topic. And if you're a follower of Jesus, then our discussion on this topic should make perfect sense to you, what we're going to talk about. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, then you can watch and maybe perhaps understand to a greater degree a standard to which followers of Christ have subjected themselves and say, oh, I get it now, maybe why they talk about that topic so much. So today we're talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And of course, the church at Corinth is in the ancient day city of Corinth, where the Apostle Paul planted a church. And this particular church actually is situated in this particular city. And the city of Corinth was like ancient day Las Vegas. It's a party city, a very pagan city, a very sensual city, a city full of pagan rituals, and there was just a lot sinful about Corinth. So Paul goes there and he starts a church. And as he starts this church, he's teaching people sort of the ways of Jesus and how to live in a Jesus community and how to follow the practices of the Bible. And then also, Paul is teaching them how they can live not just those ways, but how they live them specifically within the pagan context of such a city as Corinth. But Paul seems to somehow get some news in this letter, this first letter that we have from him, where Paul says to this church of Corinth, I found out not just that there is sexual sin going on in the city, I found that there's some sexual sin going on in the church. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians 5, starting in verse 1, where Paul addresses the sexual sin. He said, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. And he qualifies it, of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate. And then he says, here's what I found. Here's the sin. A man is sleeping with his father's wife. Now, Paul says, even the pagans would say, even the people outside the church would say, this is weird, and this is nasty, and this is wrong, and this is bad. And that Paul doesn't just stop there. He says, I'm not just addressing the sexual sin, now I'm also addressing how the church of Corinth is responding to this sin that is among you. He says in verse 2, and you, speaking to the church, you are so proud. Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this? Now, that's pretty harsh, right? But what was happening was really terrible, not, again, just sexual sin, but the fact that the church seemingly had accepted that this was okay and were not really addressing it. Paul says that there is sexual sin in your midst, there is acceptance of it, and that this has to be addressed and it has to be stopped. Now, translation to modern day. As a pastor, I've found that sexual sin does not stop at the doors of the church. In fact, I would say that the modern church, just like the church of Corinth, has been extremely hypocritical in this particular area of addressing sexual sin. Our Oceanfront campus pastor, Scott Hoffman, once paraphrased a quote from another speaker where he said, the church has lost a great deal of credibility in addressing sexual sin outside of the church because of its refusal to address sexual sin inside of the church. Now, I know what you may be thinking, but Robbie, we're not supposed to judge people. Well, that's oftentimes recounted, especially when this topic comes up. But if you read all of 1 Corinthians 5, actually Paul directly says that people who are followers of Christ should be addressing this particular sin in each other's lives. So what's an application? Well, rather than just land on all the brokenness and maybe some of the hypocrisy that's within the church and the church's refusal to address it at times, maybe I just thought I would give you all some practical advice from my own life. I thought, you know what, today I'm going to be the dad. I've got some gray hair, and I just turned 40 earlier this year, so I thought I'm going to do this. I'm actually going to give you some advice practically today for you to think about that I actually go over with couples who are in premarital counseling as they launch out into their life together. One whole session we spent on this particular topic. So here are some guardrails that my wife, Joni, and I have in our marriage to help safeguard our marriage in the area of sexual purity. First of all, we have a saying, nudity is not entertainment. The truth is, folks, that we are far too often, folks, when I say folks, by the way, I'm talking about those in the church. We are far too often entertained by immorality. If we know of a scene in a movie that contains nudity, my wife and I figure out, can that scene be easily avoided in our home where we know where it's coming up and we can fast forward it, mute anything we need to do to get past that scene where we don't have to see it. Or simply, folks, we just don't watch the movie. We don't watch the show. Nudity is not entertainment in the Hall household. This includes everything from movies to TV shows to the internet, and of course things like strip clubs or anything of the sort that would include nudity. We have internet monitoring in our home, or also it's away from our home. We have automatic filters set on the movie subscriptions that we have, like to Netflix or things like that, to be PG-13 or lower. And we don't subscribe to those premium movie channels, HBO and Skinamax and all that good stuff. Now, I know some of you are going, whoa, holy cow, this sounds so legalistic. Well, folks, I want to tell you something. As a pastor, I've discovered that most of life's greatest and longest regrets revolve around this area of sexual immorality. And I've never met anybody who said to me, Robbie, I just wish I'd taken more risk with my life sexually. But I've met a lot of people who have a lot of regret in this particular area. So nudity is not entertainment. Number one. Number two, I'm not alone, and my wife is not alone with members of the opposite sex. Almost ever. Now, we don't ride specific things. We don't ride in cars along with members of the opposite sex. We don't take trips along, like whether it be business trips or to conferences along with members of the opposite sex. And I have very, very few meetings with members of the opposite sex alone. If I do, I have a really big open window into my office that is always open and my door is always unlocked so that I'm always in public view if I'm meeting, say, with a staff member briefly about something, and members of the opposite sex. And Joni has the same policy. We don't have meetings at our house alone. We don't have anybody in our home alone as a member of the opposite sex, just to have a guardrail in that area. Number three, we don't confide in or have deep openness with members of the opposite sex. And here's a caution I would give you. If you have a friend that is a member of the opposite sex, that is considered for you a close or great friend, invite your spouse into that relationship, because otherwise, big, massive caution that I would give to you in that particular area. Number four, we have intentionally limited physical contact with members of the opposite sex. I do side hugs. If you see me at church, you'll see me oftentimes. Some people still run up and grab me. I'm not offended. We try to intentionally create a guardrail there. We do side hugs with members of the opposite sex. Number five, we do not go to bars, clubs. We don't have occupations, hobbies, or other places where temptation hangs out. We just try to say, hey, is that a place where if I'm alone or even with my spouse, it's a place where temptation hangs out? And folks, we've never had anything other than a good result of not going where temptation hangs out. Also, wedding ring. We've been married nearly 20 years, never taken it off. My wife and I, we go in public. We've just made, if I messed up and it came off, or if Joni's ring wasn't on, we wouldn't be angry with each other. We said, we're going to wear this. We're going to try to identify to the people as much as possible, hey, I'm taken. Also, number seven, what we call communications access, that my wife and I have access to each other's every password for Facebook, email, any accounts, any detailed billing, our cell phones, anything. We have open communications access with each other. Number eight, what we call financial access. All money between my wife and I is known to each other, including having joint accounts, retirement accounts, anything. We know about money. Nothing is hidden. And number nine, what we call instant access, that I'm always available and responding to my wife. She's always available and responding to me. That's a person I don't neglect. And we've communicated these. Now, to each other, we've communicated them to our children, and we've also told our children that we have expectations of you, and you can maintain a lifestyle of purity in spite of having a culture like Corinth that celebrates impurity. So some of these certainly seem so extreme, right? They do. I understand. And you don't find the list I just gave you anywhere in the Bible. But I've never met anybody who says, man, I just wish I'd taken more risk with my life, with my purity, with my relationship in the area of sex. These are our guardrails. Maybe you should make your own list today after you read 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Romans 12:2 says this, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.